The majority of large system implementations fails. That might be because of lack of scope, lack of focus, lack of knowing what you're doing.
That sounds scary, but we're here to help provide a little bit more information about what we've done in the past to make this successful and how you can avoid some of the common pitfalls that you might be faced with in your everyday work, wherever you are.
This is episode 1 of a new podcast that you're listening to, and I hope we got you on the hook for this. In this episode, you learn a little bit more about your hosts, JM and myself. And we're going to look at EA and BPM as a discipline and how we got there. And then you will learn a little bit about this new thing, the podcast that you're listening to, and what you can expect from us in season 1.
So you'll become comfortable with our voices and our message and ultimately be able to put into practice the lessons you learn in our future episodes. So today, hey, welcome to the podcast. Tomorrow, let's get to work.
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Woldt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlendson. Hey JM, how are you doing today?
Not too bad, Roland. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. So let's get started with the first one. JM, talk a little bit about you. How did you get into BPM and what are you doing?
Well, thanks so much, Roland. And as you're right, this is our very first episode. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. I'm J.M. Erlendson. I'm a transformation engineering lead, and I work at Software AG, a major platform vendor for business process management tools. And I'm really excited. I've spent the last decade and a half practicing business process excellence and process improvement across the world, working for companies as small as a couple of practitioners to some of the Fortune 500 you'd recognize as household names, both as a management consultant and as part of the solution engineering group at Software AG. So it's been a fantastic opportunity for me to practice my craft with people on the ground level, clients and practitioners who need to know things. But this is our first episode of What's Your Baseline, an opportunity to spread our message over the internet, where we have a lot of opportunity to communicate with practitioners like you, who might want to know a little bit more about why we do what we do and how we can do it. And Roland, tell me a little bit more about yourself. How are you? How are you doing? What are you excited about this podcast? And tell me more about your background.
Well, yeah, of course I'm excited. Having that idea for this thing and finally sitting in front of a microphone and chatting with you and getting it recorded is obviously awesome. Oh, yeah. But to your question, so I've worked at Software AG as well, together with JM in the same group since last November. But before that, I have about 25 years of experience working in Big Four organizations. Worked for KPMG for quite a couple of years, ran their EA group there, worked at Accenture, worked at Software AG's consulting arm for, 10 years or so, and ran the EA group there as well. So I bring a little bit of practical experience in our field. And I'm looking forward to talking with you.
A little bit of practical experience, Roland?
Yeah, a tiny bit.
I remember back in the day, you used to be my manager back in the day when at the professional services department.
Yeah, that happens.
And now we're making a podcast together. Isn't this wonderful?
So talk a little bit about your past experience. What brought you to this topic? Why are you interested in that? Why BPM? Why EA?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I started out sort of innocuously enough. I was a process engineering major in college, and I really got to know and love the idea of how to analyze and break down companies. I actually worked for a hospital when I was in my graduate studies, and watching how you can document out the way in which procedures are done and processes are executed by different practitioners and their handoffs, particularly in a life-saving context, that really enlightened me to the need for that to drive improvement across just organizations and to give people, really humans, a handle on what they have to do to make things better. And so, I started moving into management consulting. So I worked from there and worked for a couple of different clients, both public and private, through the management consulting gig, and discovered that there was so much missing in terms of the way in which people documented information, the way they shared it with others, the way they were able to use it for analysis and decision making, that it really was a revelation to them when we said, hey, let's make a regimented practice. And so I moved from the management consulting over to professional services and eventually solution engineering at a platform vendor, the one that I was using when I was working in management consulting, which is Software AG. And I used the Eris platform for the past 10 years, this decade, working at some really pretty major companies, helping to set up best practices for them, helping to establish centers of excellence, helping them to configure and manage the language and methodology by which they work on things. And that's taken me around the country. I'm from Canada, and around North America and even around the world, talking to folks who want to take this message and spread it within their organization and see the value and benefit from it. So it's been a really interesting journey, and I'm excited to continue it with you online. I know you've got a ton of really interesting experiences. I think a while ago you mentioned to me you had worked in the armed forces. I'm assuming in process management.
Oh, I did.
Tell me about where you come from.
Well, actually, I did it in both ways. So I served almost 11 years as an officer in the German Armed Forces, driving around with main battle tanks, having nothing to do with computers. So that was, the good old days way back when, through reunification. So for the young kids on the line, that's about 30 years ago. And a little bit later on, when I joined a company that was bought by Software AG in the 2000s, I was working on a huge SAP implementation with the German Armed Forces. So interesting enough, it's just like any other organization, except everybody wears blue shirts. That makes it a little bit easier and more uniform in there. But obviously the topics were the same. How do we get our processes straight? How do we get requirements for our SAP implementations? How do we rationalize the application landscape that we have here? Where do we want to spend our money? What's the biggest bang for our buck in this case? Mm-hmm. I have that history. And then obviously I've worked, and this was the first contact I had with process management way back when. I worked at Accenture at a large project with the Deutsche Bahn, the German railway system. And they were using Eris as their process documentation tool. Mm-hmm. And everybody says, oh, don't touch it, you can break something. And that basically sparked my interest, to see, oh, that's interesting, it seems to be fragile. Let's see what it is, and that was way back when in 97. That was like Eris 3, and it was really, really ugly compared to today. And the rest is history, as they say.
Well, of course, listen, if someone says you don't want to touch it, otherwise you'll break it, what's the first thing an engineer is going to do?
Of course, you're going to have a look at it.
Break out the hammer, see what cracks. I got a question for you, a little secret question. What's harder, the clients when you're in the German Armed Forces or clients when you're in private industry?
There is no difference. That's the interesting thing.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah, it's one would expect it's like a strict hierarchy. The boss says do this, and then everybody follows. No, it's the same games that you see in other organizations and whatnot. So that's not a big difference, even though everybody would say, oh, yes, sir, right, and then think they are part of it. So that's not a big difference there. And of course, it's also an interesting phenomenon when you go in there as a consultant, because they pay for you,
Ooh.
right? So therefore, your opinion and what you say is way much worth than what anybody else says, which I think is ridiculous, because everybody has a brain and good ideas, and the best idea should win.
Yeah, the best idea should win. And also, I feel like we're going to talk about this a little bit in the podcast, but also data should drive in innovation. It should drive insight and ultimately decision making. I feel like right now there's a ton of soft skills based decision making, if I can put it as such, in industry that we're seeing. We're going to be challenging a lot of those expectations and preconceived notions through the podcast. But before we get to that, I think I'd love to know a little bit more about you, and I think we want to talk a little bit about ourselves outside of the context of work. We're not just the friendly voices telling you what's best in business process management and enterprise architecture. We're also people. We love different things. For instance, I besides this gig, I have another gig that I run a music company that we make a cappella music, and I'm in a couple of different bands, Countermeasure, Beat Sync, the Rock Singers, and we sing all over the world. So when I'm not making conversation with with executives from Fortune 500 companies. I'm making conversation with thousands of people in stadiums and in parks as part of the performing that I do. So I quite enjoy that, and I love music as part of what we do. So you're going to hear a little bit of music on this podcast. Of course, that's going to be influenced by Roland and my tastes and loving things. So Roland, tell me a little bit about you. What are your other interests?
Well, before I get to talk about that, I obviously highly recommend to listen to JM's recording.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to put some links to the websites and the recordings in the show notes, and I highly recommend to look at it. Oh, so compared to you, JM, I'm absolutely boring, right? So I'm a middle-aged man living in Northern Virginia.
Oh.
Yeah, as you might have heard with my accent, I come from the fatherland, so I'm a German. I've worked my first 40 years in Germany and then moved to the US in 2007. And when you think about my interests, it's basically two words. It's coffee and motorcycle. And you can see and decide for yourself what you think is more important and what not. So I like both. And this morning, I had both.
Ooh.
Yay.
Hopefully in that order, not just motorcycles first and then you wake up with the coffee.
It was motorcycle, drive to a cafe, have a coffee, hop on the motorcycle, drive back home to do this recording with you.
Oh, well, that sounds like a wonderful day so far. Let's keep it going. Let's make it even better.
So speaking of which, JM, what are your bucket list item, if you will?
Sure, I'd love to. I do a lot of things. I do a lot of travel. I love traveling the world. It's been a passion of mine, and actually something I've been doing since very, very young. I was on my first plane at 6 months old, and I've never stopped. And on my bucket list, number one is walking the pilgrimage in Shikoku, in Japan, on the island of Shikoku. It's a bunch of temples you walk between. It's usually a pretty long walk. Like we're talking like 40 to 50 days. I mean, I don't know how I'm going to get the time off work, but I'll make it work. But it's going to be a really fun time to experience sort of being in the moment, being in nature, being outside, and really getting on your feet for a good period of time. I think it'd be a good opportunity to reflect, particularly after the crazy year we've all had now. And speaking about taking time to reflect, what are you looking to do on your bucket list of items?
Yeah, crazy and COVID and all that stuff. Besides, I'm also like to travel. So one of my bucket list items is to pick up my Jeep and just drive down the Pan American Highway down to Argentina and Chile, which obviously is quite a trip. You estimate about 6 to 12 months for this, and you have to ship your car to South America. So there's no direct way to drive. Because there's a thing called a Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. So it's quite a logistical effort. And obviously you want to coordinate that with your employer, that you're out of office for some extended time. And we'll see if and when we make it happen.
I was thinking 40 to 50 days, and you were thinking 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, it is quite a bit. So,
well, I'm glad we're making this podcast as a record of our thoughts, feelings, and best practices, so that when you're out of the office, we can replay it for our clients, and maybe they'll get the same insights.
Yeah, the good news is we can record podcasts on the road. So you, my dear listeners, will not notice a difference, except of whatever background noises and whatnot. We'll see.
Well, that leads us to the first of what we're doing today on our questions in the practice of business process management and enterprise architecture. Now, let's start with the beginning for people's experiences. You're obviously here listening to this podcast because you want to know a little bit more about what it is and why it works. But I want you to think about, and maybe even take out a piece of paper and write down and reflect on your memories of the first time you discovered anything around these letters: BPA, EA, BPM. What caught your attention? What are your three memories or first thoughts about what came to mind when you heard those letters or were asked to think about those topics? All right, that's time, folks. Well, thank you so much for writing some things down, but I'd actually like to find out a little bit more about you, Roland. What are 3 things you remember about your first time discovering BPA or enterprise architecture? What feelings did they conjure in you? And what inspired you to get into the field as a result of those things?
Well, it's as I said before, it was that project with the Deutsche Bahn where I got first exposed on it, and I thought it's really interesting because that project was about standing up a greenfield organization. Right, so they had to figure out what are we going to do. It was the time of the privatization of the Bahn, the railway system, and they just needed to figure out what do we want to do. And obviously, a process management tool was a godsend for them. Right, that was one thing where I first got exposed to it. Even though at that time I was working, believe it or not, in the change management group of Accenture. Talking with people and how to communicate things and whatnot, which obviously has a benefit when you have your processes and your architecture being documented. And at some point when you implement something new, you can answer simple questions like, what has changed? Which is also always an evergreen, because in most implementations I work with, it was like, the business people said, I can tell you what happened in the old system. And the system integrator came and said, I can tell you what the tool can do, but both never come together. And I've been on projects that actually failed because of that, because they couldn't manage the scope correctly and whatnot.
It must have been quite a relief to have that kind of that discipline in place to make sure that you could answer whatever questions came up and be able to see a source of truth for that knowledge,
If people take it serious.
If they take it serious.
Most of the clients I've worked with, unfortunately, say, let's just diagram something and we move on. It's more important we get the running system and whatnot, right? And then later on, imagine if you have an enterprise-wide software like an SAP system, for example, there's obviously dependencies between the different modules to each other. So you start with one module, you take your best guess, you make the best decisions that you could, with all the caveats that your stakeholders that you should work with might not be available. So you, as the implementer, make a decision for them, right? And sell it as, this is the best design, whatever. And then you fast forward, and then that second module comes in, and you haven't realized what are the dependencies between those two. So your decision that either you as the implementer or you as the stakeholder in module 1 has done does not match, or conceptually might be out of whack with what module 2 would see. And this is one of the biggest things that I've seen in SAP implementations or in overall enterprise software implementations as well. And that brought me to the point, hey, it might be useful to not only look at individual aspects, you map out your application landscape or whatever, right? But see it as a holistic whole thing. You go and you have your processes that are driven by strategy. And unfortunately, most clients don't have an idea what they're in there. It's very fuzzy, And then map out your processes, map out your organization and what the impact is for your roles and how you structure and restructure, which with Deutsche Bahn was a godsend because you had to figure out how do we organize. And then the same thing for applications and data and whatnot. And that basically was what created the interest in me to go into this field and hang in there for 25 years. But how was that for you in this? How did you get into these topics and why do you still hang in there?
Why do I still hang in there? Well, that's a good question.
Besides your paycheck.
Well, the truth of the matter is that I see it kind of like you do as the connective tissue that brings all the aspects of the organization together to help reveal them, help you understand them, help you communicate them, and help you make decisions on them. When I first discovered BPA was actually very early in college, prior to any sort of work that I had done. I took a course on process management, and in that course, it revealed to me the way in which you conceptualize information. Of course, it was all just documents and flowcharts, but it at least gave me some visual reference that helped me explain things better, both to my friends and also to myself. I'm a very visual learner, and that was my first touch. And the first thing I thought to myself is, this is way easier than trying to talk it through. This is way easier. I can just show you a picture and this will explain it. And it came about again, as I was in school, my parents' business, they were undergoing a sale of the business. They wanted to get out and retire. And one of the things I did for them was help to outline how their small little business worked and who they interacted with, what things they needed along the way. And it forced me to ask questions that were ingrained through the discipline that I'd gotten in the college course, which is, okay, so who does this? Okay, so what information do I need to be able to do this thing? Or what resources do I have to have in place? Are you using any systems? And these are all questions that come up organically if you're trained or your thinking is aligned to the different elements that contribute, the context under which process happens. And then in my professional career, one of my first really big successes was working with an organization here in Canada, a hydroelectric company that was focused on power transmission. And we, similar to a lot of people who work on ERP implementations, they were re-implementing SAP, and they wanted to see how the whole chain stuck together from, inventory management, sourcing, procurement, down all the way to operations. And that was only possible because we were able to segment the information by different groups and how they were operating, tie them together through their impact analysis, and ultimately be able to make decisions on this holistic vision you talked about before. And, the word relief is really a thing I said. I think I was hearing that a little bit in what you were telling, but I got to tell you, as a junior on a project, when you're tasked to know a lot of things, I worked in QA and for the process management and process design, and it was a huge aspect of relief for me to be able to have everything at my fingertips and be able to understand what I needed to do at every point in time. And that was only achievable through good practices and good centers of excellence and competency, and ultimately a platform that brought information together. And that's where I first learned about the practice really in a professional capacity, and developed my skills and developed my passion for this.
Yeah, I remember those times when I was junior and a newbie on place, and the pain you go through because there's so high expectations, Oh, we're going to pay X amount of dollars for you, now deliver. And you're just thinking like, holy crap, what am I doing here? And there's that internal competition, and you don't want to ask people and whatnot. Yes, I completely understand that situation, even though it's ages ago.
Speaking about ages ago, you started What's Your Baseline? So tell us a little bit more about that, and why don't we talk about what this is?
The idea was that there is a need in, quote unquote, the market, right? So there is a discipline out there. When you look at it, and we will have another whole episode talking about how the discipline of EA and the discipline of BPM came together and why it's important. But when I look at this, there is obviously a need, a continuous need, because there's always new people, right, that join the party, just like you and I way back when, being as junior people and having to learn something. And I just looked around and I didn't find anything. There were a handful of EA podcasts, and they stopped after episode 4, right? Or went into some super geeky space that's not consumable for non-geeks.
Yeah.
I couldn't find a lot of websites to that topic. What you see is the vendor communities, right? And this might end up in, I have a problem with installing your tool. Can you help me, right? Instead of reaching out to the support, these type of things. But what I've not found was a place where people talk about the discipline. And that is another thing that's, I think, very important to say, if we want to do this in a professional way, we obviously should have a discipline that prescribes how to do things, where you have a lively conversation around how to improve and push things forward. And the big mistake that EAs did, defining standards and all that type of stuff, right? Which was obviously 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the big bad thing.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but you've worked in a lot of organizations where the teams end up being deliverable focused, right? There's not a lot of strategy around it. It's literally just, hey, somebody asked us to make a thing. Let's go make that thing. And I don't know if there's any value in this at all. Well, I'm assuming, and I'm hearing from you as well, that establishing strategy, establishing best practices, establishing a routine and a center of competence. I mean, those are ways we can turn around these deliverable focused organizations and initiatives into strategic initiatives, into sustainable initiatives, and ultimately into better business practices for organizations we work with, and for anyone who'd like to come in and listen at this podcast and learn some lessons from it.
You need the openness of a client to do this, right?
Yeah.
And I've worked on projects where they put a huge effort in to create documentation, with macros and whatnot. And then you had your ERP implementation, and you hand over the 700-page printout of the documentation, say, hey, Mr. Client, here's my documentation. And everybody in that game, everybody knows nobody will ever read this, right? So the question is, how can you produce something that quote unquote lives, right? That will be used. And this is one of the interesting things in architecture and architecture tools is you can use those artifacts for additional purposes, right? Like training, like communication. What has changed, as I mentioned before? You could use it for job aids. You can use it for planning purposes and whatnot. But anyways, to come back to your question, what's your baseline? That was one of the reasons where I saw a gap in the market. And then when you ask about the name, what's your baseline? Well, that comes obviously from the project management discipline, because when you do your project plan, you have an initial cut, which is your baseline. And then you obviously adapt your project plan going forward. Right. The other reason for that is also when you think about architecture in general and improvement stuff in general, well, guess what? You need a baseline where to start to show what is the improvement. How did we change over time? Did we reach our objectives? That's the strategy aspect in here. Did we reach this in the time that we wanted? Did we get the business outcome that we expected? And this is also, and we will talk about that later in another episode, it's also the golden grail of how do I measure the practice? How do I know when I'm successful? And then people come up with KPIs like, oh yeah, how many trainings did we do in this project? No, that's not relevant, right? It's relevant 6 months after the project has ended and you went live and you reorganized and you put in a new system. Do those changes make an impact? Is our bottom line better? Are our customers more happy? Is the operations of our shop floor or retail store more efficient? Those are the metrics that you look at. And looking at this, and the EA discipline is 30 odd years old, I haven't seen anyone who came up with a good set of criteria. So dear listeners, if you made it up to here, if you have your ideas, hey, please let us know in the comments. Reach out to us, and I will give you more information a little bit at the end of this episode.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Roland, but it sounds like that you're looking to start people on the right path. And of course, their circumstances, their clients, their organization, those circumstances are going to be different person to person, organization to organization. That's totally fine. But what's your baseline is helping to equip you with the tools and the mindset required to approach each new situation with a discipline and a practice that allows it to be, in some ways solved through enterprise architecture, through business process management, best practices and approaches. So you know what you're doing, you know how to know which questions to ask, and you know how to respond to the answers you get.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But Jam, talk a little bit about this podcast, and I know we spoke about different seasons and content of those seasons. Obviously, this is season 1, episode 1.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about season 1, what it is, what you can expect as a listener. What are the major topics that we're going to cover?
Yeah, absolutely. Season 1 is meant to set you up and give you some ideas of where we're coming from. Obviously, we can't cover everything right off the bat, but we want to answer some big questions and challenge your assumptions and ideas. Things like, why does architecture matter? Why does business process management matter? What are those disciplines about? And how do we address early in our sort of evolution, how do we address the challenges that those present and the opportunities that those allow? And then how do we achieve that? What sort of platforms and tooling and different technologies can we use to get better at this and to automate a lot of the things that could become really sources of work and manual effort? And how do you select how to move forward with those and implement them particularly not only in the context of an organization, but also in the context of a project. So we're going to talk about large-scale implementations and how to build in practices and technologies to make those go better and faster and with less risk to you and your organization. We're also going to address some interesting conversations and thoughts around methodologies, approaches, practices, and visualizations and notations. How do I communicate ideas? What do those ideas look like? And how do I bring people together around those ideas so that they can see on the page something that intuitively means something to them? So that's going to be a good chunk of what we're talking about at the beginning of the season. But Roland, then we're going to start talking with people and data. Tell me a little bit more about how that's going to work in the latter half of the season.
We do. So the idea is not, dear listeners, that you just listen to the friendly conversation that JM and I have, which I hope you enjoy. But we obviously have a couple of topics identified that need to be worked out in more detail, but a couple of topics identified that we will have guests in our show here. Mm-hmm. So we are talking with practitioners and people with a similar experience who might run their own shop or might be part of a larger organization. And the first two topics that come into mind is the topic around agile, scaled agile and architecture.
Yeah.
Are they mutually exclusive or do they belong together, right? And we have a guest lined up who will talk with us about that topic. Or the other big topic that is currently really hot in our industry is process mining. So we're happy that hopefully we get one of the product managers of one of the major vendors here to get his perspective. So the idea is to have a good mix between JM and I doing a conversation around a certain topic, but then mix in different interviews with experts from the field that then give their different perspective or maybe they agree with us, who knows.
So Roland, we're actually doing both podcasts and live interviews and conversations, but what can our audience expect in terms of timelines? So when should be looking out for the What's Your Baseline podcasts, and how long is season 1?
So obviously, when you're listening to this episode, you've made it. You've made it into August. That's the idea that we have to go live in early August 2021. And then the idea is to have a bi-weekly schedule. So every other Monday, most likely, we're going to have a new episode ready for you so that on your morning commute, when we all are allowed to go back to the office, that on your morning commute on a Monday morning, you have something to listen to. We're planning about 12 episodes per season. So if you do the math, we're going to end season 1 sometime in December. And we'll have a little break over the holidays. And then we'll have another 5-month series starting in January. Have a little break in summer, 4th of July and all that wonderful vacation that everybody has. And then have hopefully a season 3 in fall with a similar schedule that we have this year.
But of course, this is all going to rely on you, our wonderful listeners, subscribing to the podcast, joining in the conversation, and giving us great feedback.
So yeah, thanks, JM. This brings us to the end of this episode, right? So we spoke a little bit about who we are, how we got into the field of architecture and process management, and some high-level experience. And we spoke about what this podcast is about. And by the way, we also have a company website where you find articles a little bit more frequently every week, we hope, so that you get something to read as well. First of all, thank you for listening to this show. We're all learning. We're all learning together on this. I hope you found it interesting. Reach out to us. The best way to do this is either shoot us an email at hello@whatsyourbaseline.com or leave us a voice message. We're going to put a link into the show notes. And if you like, leave a rating and a review in your podcatcher of choice wherever you listen to this. And hopefully you see us on our website, whatsyourbaseline.com, and hopefully we're going to hear each other the next time.
That'd be wonderful. Once again, I am JM Erlendson.
And I'm Roland Woldt.
And we'll see you in the next one.